Hello everyone, this is Mari Chan and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are continuing the reading of Thousand Autumns, Volume 3, also known as Qianqiu by Meng Xi Shi. We will be reading chapters 60 through 63. That's 4 chapters today. I hope you all enjoy. Chapter 60, Onward to Ruoqiang. When the sun slipped low in the west, Bana returned with the sheep. As always, she first herded them into the pen, but kept the lamb she was holding in her arms and brought it with her to Shenqiao's room. There she knocked. Shenqiao quickly came to open the door. On seeing Bana, he smiled at her. "You're back." He turned to the side, but Bana didn't enter, instead only poking her head in. She was still afraid that Yan Wushi would go insane like he had yesterday. But that man merely sat on the bed, quietly watching her. His expression didn't seem as violent as yesterday either. "He's already fully recovered?" asked Bana. Shenqiao gave a wry smile and shook his head. "I fear he's gotten worse." "Oh," said Bana. Now she was even more afraid to go in. Shenqiao didn't know how to explain the complicated situation Yan Wushi was in. He could only try to summarize it in a few words. He's suffering from a head injury, so sometimes he's clear-minded, other times he isn't. Most of the time, he isn't. "Is he clear-headed now?" Bana said at Yan Wushi curiously, and he looked back at her too. His dark, tranquil eyes made her shiver inexplicably. "He's not." Bana's fear returned. "Will he still grab people by the neck?" "He probably won't," said Shenqiao. "Right now, his mind seems to be close to that of a young child's. He can't even speak clearly. I was too careless last time. In the future, I'll make sure he never hurts the two of you ever again." Bana had never heard of this kind of situation before. She blinked a couple of times, watching Yan Wushi, and Yan Wushi blinked back at her. Bana and Shenqiao fell silent, then Shenqiao kneaded his temples. Bana thought for a moment before putting the lamb she was holding on the ground. She urged it to Yan Wushi and smiled. "Why don't we let him play with the lamb? The village children all love lambs." The little lamb was a spotless white. Just the sight of it made one want to squeeze and pet it. Even Shenqiao thought it was adorable. Yet Yan Wushi's brows pinched as he watched the lamb totter toward him. It lowered its head to sniff at his robe when he suddenly reached out and gave it a vicious shove. The little lamb bleated, stumbling a few steps before falling to its knees. Throwing her fear of Yan Wushi to the side, Bana quickly ran over to pick up the lamb. Shenqiao frowned at Yan Wushi, but he only gazed back with an innocent expression. "Bana, let me deal with this. Go ahead and finish your tasks." After that little interlude, there was obviously some lingering fear in Bana's heart. She nodded and obediently left with the lamb without another word. "Why did you push the lamb just now?" asked Shenqiao. Yan Wushi only looked at him without reply. But Shenqiao faintly realized something. No matter how much someone's personality changed or how confused their memories became, everyone had some intrinsic qualities etched deep into their bones that couldn't be changed. Yan Wushi had always been a distrustful man, and even if he only possessed a few scattered memories now, that point would not change. Shenqiao said, "Give me your hand. I'll take your pulse." Yan Wushi held out his hand. There was a clear contrast between his attitude towards Shenqiao and the way he treated Bana. But Shenqiao knew that it was because Yan Wushi possessed an uncanny instinct that told him that Shenqiao would never hurt him. Shenqiao placed 3 fingers on his pulse and asked, "Can you move your hands and feet now? How about standing and walking?" Yan Wushi nodded. "I can, but I feel dizzy." Shenqiao tried to probe. "This morning, you told me that it was too late to go back to Chang'an. Do you remember that?" Yan Wushi gave him a blank stare. Shenqiao couldn't help but heave a long sigh. "Why don't you lie down and rest?" Perhaps he'd return to normal again after sleeping? Even a sarcastic, mocking Yan Wushi was far better than his current state of complete ignorance. But Yan Wushi refused. "Don't want to." So he didn't want to sleep. If it'd been an ordinary child, there would have been many ways to coax him. But this was no child. Asking Shenqiao to say gentle and tender words, the kind he'd used on a child, to Yan Wushi's face? It was impossible. As the two of them stared at each other at an impasse, a knock sounded at the door. As though he'd been granted amnesty, Shun Chao let out an imperceptible sigh of relief, then stood to open the door. It was Bana. She'd fried some flatbread and brought it over with the lamb soup. The two of them exchanged a couple of words by the door. Shun Chao thanked her and closed the door after she left, heading back inside. Shun Chao placed the lamb soup and flatbread in front of Yan Wushi. Are you hungry? Eat. Yan Wushi glanced at Shun Chao, then quickly dropped his head and mumbled, Feed me. Shun Chao fell silent. After a long time with no reply, Yan Wushi raised his head to look at Shun Chao, then said hesitantly, like last time, Kiss. If I knock him unconscious right now, will he wake up with a more normal personality? Shun Chao contemplated this with all seriousness. Yan Wushi seemed to have sensed the impending danger. He swallowed down the kiss that was halfway out of his mouth and huddled in the corner of the bed. Shun Chao took another sigh, pushing the lamb soup to him while he picked himself up some flatbread. He tore off a small piece and popped it into his mouth, chewing slowly. Only then did Yan Wushi scoot back from the bed's corner. He reached for the soup. His meridians were injured, his bones damaged. His hands still trembled slightly as he held the bowl, but nowhere near as much as when he'd first woken up. It was obvious that he'd recovered quite a bit. Shun Chao watched as he lowered his head and sipped the soup little by little. Something occurred to him, and he suddenly asked, Were you worried about the soup? That's why you wanted me to feed you? That way, the soup would have to enter Shun Chao's mouth first, and if it were poisoned, he'd collapse first as well. Yan Wushi didn't reply, but his silence itself was already an answer. Shun Chao should have been furious, but he answered calmly, I don't know how much you remember, and even if I say I have no intention of hurting you, you might not believe me. However, Bana and her grandfather are good people. Since we must stay here for now, you should restrain yourself a little, lest you hurt their feelings. I also won't allow you to hurt anyone else anymore. Yan Wushi remained silent. Shun Chao didn't know what else to say, so he also fell quiet. Once he'd believed that, given enough time, even someone like Yan Wushi could be moved, that full-hearted sincerity could wear down even metal and stone. Only just now did he realize how ridiculously wrong he'd been. No matter how Yan Wushi changed, the only person he'd ever trust was himself. The two of them sat by themselves, one on the bed and the other at the table. Though there was only a short distance between them, their gazes never met. More precisely speaking, Shun Chao was eating with his head lowered while Yan Wushi was watching Shun Chao. After a long time, Yan Wushi finally spoke. 没人哥哥. This address instantly elicited a full body shudder from Shun Chao. He was about to correct him when a burst of noise came from outside. He listened attentively for a moment, then abruptly stood and began heading out. He didn't forget to look back and tell Yan Wushi, You stay here, don't come out. Elsewhere, Bana had also heard the noise. She thought little of it and assumed her grandfather had returned. With a cheer, she ran out to greet him. The moment she opened the gate, however, she saw a troop of men on horses galloping toward her, dust rolling behind them. Her grandfather wasn't among them all. Bana immediately remembered that Shun Chao and Yan Wushi were still here. Suspecting that the other party had come for them, she tried to close the gate, ready to turn and inform Shun Chao. However, the men were faster than she was. One of them reined in his horse and dismounted, then strode up and kicked open the courtyard gate. It all happened so quickly that Bana had no time to react. Bana gasped as the impact from the gate being kicked open forced her to stumble back several steps, and she almost fell to the ground. But a hand landed on her lower back as she staggered, immediately stopping her from teetering back further. Once she'd found her footing, Shun Chao let go and turned to the newcomer. Who is this gentleman? Another man in the back dismounted his horse. He strode up to them, pulling down the scarf that covered his face, and then cupped his hands at Shun Chao. I apologize for my subordinate's rudeness and how he scared this young lady, he said. I came to find you. There were too many people back at the inn, so we didn't have the chance for a real discussion. Have you been doing well, Taoist Master Shun? After a long separation, a reappraisal was due. The man's speech was courteous and refined, and even his smile brimmed with confidence. A glance was enough to know that he'd been among the elites for a while, living in luxury. He was no longer the Chung Gong from the past who'd been uneducated, a little coarse, and yet keen in his own way. Looking again at the men who'd come with Chung Gong, Shen Chao unexpectedly saw some familiar faces among them, one being the patriarch of Qi's Muzhong family, Ruoqiang. The same Ruoqiang who'd appeared at Chuyuan Temple to seize the cargo the Liu He Guild had been escorting. Things really have changed. The martial expert who'd once sold himself to the imperial court of Qi had become Chung Gong's subordinate. One couldn't help but marvel at the vagaries of fate. Shen Chao withdrew his gaze from Wu Rongqing, Tuoba Liangzhi, and the others. He looked at Chung Gong and said harshly, "This place is remote and distant, yet County Duke Chun managed to find it anyway. How did you know I was here?" Chung Gong glanced at Bana and smiled. "I met an old man. I believe he's this young lady's grandfather." Bana was alarmed, but also still somewhat confused. However, Shen Chao's face fell. "If there's something you want, just bring it to me. Why involve innocent bystanders?" Contrary to expectations, Chung Gong's tone was consoling. "Don't be nervous. I only wished to ask him your whereabouts. Now that I know, I naturally won't do anything to him. The wind is harsh out in the open, which makes it hard to talk. Won't you invite me inside?" Hearing that her grandfather had been captured, Bana's entire body grew weak. Shen Chao reached out to support her. After a brief moment of silence, he said, "This way, please." Rongqing and the others were about to follow, but Chung Gong stopped him. "Taoist Master Shun is an upright gentleman. He won't do anything to me. You can just wait outside." The mighty Rongqing was the foremost martial artist in the imperial court of Qi, and he'd held himself with great arrogance that night in Chuyuan Temple. Yet at this moment, in front of Chung Gong, he was as docile as a mouse before a cat, following each order with the appropriate action and without an extra word. He cupped his hands at Chung Gong, then brought the others to stand guard outside. Chung Gong followed Shen Chao inside. He gave a surprised sound and then smiled brightly. "Where is Sect Leader Yan?" He'd probably received quite a bit of information interrogating the old man. Shen Chao didn't reply as they each sat down. Then he cut straight to the chase. "What does County Duke Chun require from his visit this time?" Chung Gong smiled. "In the end, we still count as old friends. You showed me kindness before. What kind of person would I be if I repaid that with evil? So, you need not look at me like that, Taoist Master Shun." Shen Chao said coolly, "This humble Taoist dares not claim the credit. County Duke Chun has already repaid that trifling favor with several chests full of sandwiches. If County Duke Chun can show great magnanimity and release the old man, I will be endlessly grateful." "Nothing's happened to him," said Chung Gong. "He'll be released sooner or later. You need not worry. Previously at the capital, I had something I wanted to discuss with you, but you left in such a rush and vanished in the blink of an eye. I had no choice but to do something like this." Shen Chao had no reply. Chung Gong was unconcerned with his coldness. After a pause, he continued, "I indeed came here today due to a certain matter. I wish to cooperate with Taoist Master Shun on something." He suddenly changed the topic. "Outside, rumor has it Sect Leader Yan is already dead. I never thought that he'd still be alive or that you were the one who saved him. From what I know, Yan Wushi was rather unkind to you, yet you repaid evil with virtue, letting bygones be bygones. Such breadth of mind is truly admirable." Shen Chao wasn't someone who liked mocking others, but he was enraged at Chung Gong threatening him with the old man. He couldn't help but reply, "People who repay kindness with treachery are everywhere in this world, so why would repaying evil with virtue be any stranger?" It was a line full of implications, and Chung Gong's expression flickered. But in the next moment, he again smiled as if nothing were wrong. "It's been a while since our last meeting. Taoist Master Shun's tongue has grown quite sharp. I wonder what those experts who ambushed Yan Wushi would do if they knew he was still alive. Taoist Master Shun is an exceptional martial artist, true, but even if you can deal with Yu-I, can you deal with Guangling San and Duan Yang, let alone that old monk Xueting?" Are these the words the cooperation that County Duke Chun was referring to? Of course not, said Chunggong. Does Taoist Master Shun know of Ruoqiang? Ruoqiang. Shun Chao repeated the word twice in his mind. It sounded like a person's name. He shook his head. Chunggong said, "The Book of Han, Memoir of the Western Regions, thus says, on exiting the southern pass, the closest location is a country named Ruoqiang, and this small country was destroyed by Shanshan." Only last year, Chunggong had been completely illiterate, yet now he could recite the Book of Han with perfect ease. The Lord of Qi might have been a capricious fool, but if he were to favor someone, they'd have to possess something extraordinary. Looking at this, Chunggong was indeed worthy of the emperor's fondness. Shun Chao didn't speak. He quietly waited for him to continue. "Pardon me for being blunt," said Chunggong. "Ruoqiang mined jade. Though now destroyed, the ruins of the ancient city were still there. It used to be rich in a special kind of carnelian that can't be found anywhere else, and that's what I'm looking for. As for why I wish for your cooperation, it's because your martial prowess would be a great boon to me. But there's something in it for you as well. That thing is called jade sistanch, and it grows near the carnelian deposits. It can rejoin bones, regenerate muscles, and is miraculously effective on internal injuries. I believe that sect leader Yan might have need of it." After that, he spoke no more and waited for Shun Chao's response. The room was quiet, except for Bana's occasional sniffles. The rims of her eyes were red. Shun Chao was silent for a long moment. "You're afraid that I'll refuse to go, so you're holding Bana's father elsewhere and threatening me with him." Chunggong remained undaunted. "Correct. I don't know why you saved Yan Wushi after what he did to you, so I can't be certain that you'd be willing to take such a risk for him. But I know the kind of person you are. You could never stand by and let an innocent man suffer because of you." "Thank you. You've truly understood me well," said Shun Chao coolly. "In that case, Taoist Master Shun has agreed?" "Do I have any other choice?" Chunggong smiled. "Indeed, you do not. Worry not, the old man is unharmed. I'll have someone release him upon our return. Release him first, then I'll go with you." Chunggong shook his head, still smiling. "I can't do that. Why would you say that, Taoist Master Shun? The only way you'd earnestly come on this trip is if I held the old man above you. Oh, that's right. Since sect leader Yan is probably in poor health, I've already ordered some men to prepare sufficient quantities of food and medicine for him. You can be at ease in bringing him." These words were a test. Chunggong suspected that even if Yan Wushi hadn't died in the ambush by 5 martial artists, he'd still be injured, so it'd be difficult for him to return to his previous strength. But Shun Chao neither confirmed or denied it. He had no intention of replying at all. So Chunggong could only say, "If there are no issues, let's leave tomorrow morning. I'm certain Ruoqiang has already found me a place to stay for the night. I'll go and rest first, then come find you tomorrow. You should get some rest too. Ruoqiang is a long way from here. We must properly use this respite and conserve our strength." "Shenlangjun." Bana gazed at Shun Chao as if pleading for help. Shun Chao finally gave a wry smile. "I don't know what I can do to apologize. This all happened because of me. I promise that I'll come back soon. I'll see that your grandfather returns safely as well." He took out all the meager money he still had on him. "Here, take it, in case it's necessary." Bana shook her head. "I don't want it." "Be good," said Shun Chao gently. "Stay at home, and unless you must, don't stray too far. I will definitely return your grandpa to you, safe and sound." Few people could resist this "be good" from Shun Chao. Bana's heart had been in a desperate panic, but now she slowly began to calm down. She didn't blame Shun Chao for bringing trouble to her family, because this girl was very considerate, and she knew that Shun Chao must feel hundreds or thousands of times more awful than she did at this moment. She nodded. "You have to be careful." Shun Chao gave her a comforting smile and said only 4 words. "Everything will be fine." Ruoqiang really had used some unknown method to seize a relatively comfortable house within the village. The original owner had been forced to stay at someone else's place, and the entire village kept a wide berth from these sudden newcomers, as if they were venomous scorpions. Fortunately, Chunggong had no interest in staying long. Early the next morning, Ruoqiang arrived on orders and knocked. After the third knock, the gates opened, and Shen Chao walked out with Yan Wushi. It'd been a while since Yan Wushi had stood and walked, so his limbs were all a little stiff. Furthermore, he was still suffering from serious internal injuries. Every step he took aggravated his wounds. Hence, he moved at a very slow pace. That night, at Chuyuan Monastery, Yan Wushi had practically dropped down from the sky and completely destroyed the Zhuyang strategy, and he'd humiliated Ruoqiang's party quite a bit with his poisonous tongue. Now they saw him as a fallen tiger, his face pale and body plagued by illness, and Ruoqiang couldn't help the burst of schadenfreude that came from his lips. I trust that sect leader Yan remembers his old friends from Chuyuan Temple, he sneered. You truly don't look too well. Now that Yan Wushi had become a public enemy across the entire land, with all sorts of factions raring to kill him, Ruoqiang thought Yan Wushi beneath himself. Yan Wushi's face was impassive. Even his eyes looked like they'd been soaked in well water and were bone-chillingly cold. For some reason, these eyes staring at him caused Ruoqiang to swallow back his more spiteful words. Chunggong came over, his movements confident and easy. A number of people followed behind him. His presence was magnificent, no longer that of the helpless youth who'd been mistreated by his stepmother and left the house in anger. Environment influences demeanor. Upbringing influences base character. When someone's status and position in society change, so too will their personality. Ready to go, Taoist Master Shun? Shen Chao nodded. We'll ride horses first. There's a small town right before we enter the desert. We'll switch to fresh mounts there. He was languid and carefree, completely unworried about the prospect of Shen Chao turning hostile. Ignoring that he still had Bana's grandfather, even if Shen Chao took Chunggong hostage, his party still had the advantage of numbers. All they needed to do then was capture a villager to use as a hostage, and Shen Chao's hands would be tied. Shen Chao knew this as well, so he made no rash actions. What do you need the carnelian for? Chunggong smiled. I expected you to ask me this yesterday instead of waiting until now. That carnelian has a certain ability that's highly important to me, but the ancient ruins have been deserted for many years. I don't know what kind of dangers we'll be facing this time. Every additional ally means additional strength. I didn't think about asking you in the beginning, but after seeing your moves in the capital, my confidence has increased greatly. With Taoist Master Shun here, we'll be many times more powerful. Shen Chao didn't respond. When he saw Chunggong lead 2 horses over, he said, I'll ride together with you. Chunggong glanced at Yan Wushi. What kind of injury ails sect leader Yan? He looks a little vacant. Can he no longer even recognize people? Yan Wushi answered coldly. My venerable self can recognize people just fine. I just can't be bothered to waste words on you. Do you think you're all that because you've latched onto Galway? In this venerable one's eyes, you're still nothing more than an insect. Chunggong's expression twisted, but he reached out to stop Tuoba Liangzhe behind him from drawing his sword, still using words as bold as these when in such dire straits. I hope you can still say these things once the Gokturks and Buddhist factions know you're still alive. Yan Wushi sneered. Did Galway only teach you how to mouth off while you were in his bed? If you're dissatisfied, feel free to come at me. Chunggong frowned. He was a little perturbed, wondering if his information was wrong, that perhaps Yan Wushi wasn't only alive but wholly uninjured. Could he have managed to fool all 5 of these great martial experts? Despite knowing this was terribly unlikely, when the subject was a monster like Yan Wushi, even the strangest and most impossible things seemed to become logical. Not only Chunggong, but even Ruoqiang, Tuoba Liangzhe, and the others still held some fear in their hearts. A person's reputation was akin to the shadow cast by a tree. Even if the Huanyue sect leader was only standing there, it was enough to make everyone question themselves. As it was said, only an evil person could torment other evil people. No matter how powerful Shen Qiao was, he could never pull this off. Changong didn't waste too much time. He waved his hand, and everyone mounted their horses, ready to depart. Shen Qiao had Yan Wushi mount first. Then he moved to sit in front of him in order to steer the horse. Everyone set off. Several dozen horses trotted along the road, the wind and sand muffling everyone's voices. At this time, even speaking became an arduous task, since sand would get in the moment they opened their mouths. No one was willing to eat sand, so they just hung their heads and continued onward, communicating with each other through gestures. Arms wrapped tightly around Shen Qiao's waist and a chest pressed right up against his back. Yan Wushi leaned closer to his ear and said quietly, "Ah, Qiao, how did I do earlier?" As soon as Shen Qiao heard that gentle tone, he was certain that this Yan Wushi was not the normal Yan Wushi. He noticed that he'd been sighing more often the last few days than he'd ever done in the past. Xieling? Yan Wushi was a little surprised. "How did you know that my old name was Xieling?" Shen Qiao's only answer was silence. Chapter 61. Discoveries. If talking with Yan Wushi in the past had him raging himself to an early death, then talking to Yan Wushi right now was like raging to death and then being brought back to life by the force of that same rage. Those who lacked a strong will would surely be unable to continue the conversation. Shen Qiao sighed and decided just to shut his mouth, refusing to speak further. But when the man in the back saw him refusing to talk, his arms tightened as he placed his chin on Shen Qiao's shoulder. "Ah, Qiao, why are you ignoring me?" "Because right now I'm contemplating whether to knock you out before we keep going," Shen Qiao thought. He tilted his head a little to the side and lowered his voice. "Since you still remember who you are, then do you know why Changong is looking for carnelian in the Ruoqiang's ancient city?" "I don't know," said Yan Wushi. "But I've heard about jade cistanche before. It usually grows deep inside the Gobi Desert and is normally hidden within rocky crevices. It's incredibly difficult to find and indeed a rare treasure. But it's clear that Changong is only looking for the carnelian. He just brought up the jade cistanche as bait so he could get us to run here and there for him." Even in the past, when he hadn't been injured, Shen Qiao had rarely heard him analyze anything in such a placid tone. "Yes, I noticed as well," said Shen Qiao. "But even if there is no jade cistanche, he's been holding Bana's grandfather hostage, so I was forced to take this trip with him. However, if we can find the jade cistanche, you'll be able to fully recover from your wounds." "In truth, my wounds lie in the flaw within my demonic core. The jade cistanche can only cure external wounds, so it won't be of much help." Shen Qiao was amused. "You have a crack in your skull. The jade cistanche can spur muscle growth and rejoin bones. So it'll have its uses, no? Surely you must heal the external injuries first." "Actually, I don't wish to heal." "What? Wait, why?" Yan Wushi sounded dejected. Shen Qiao frowned. "Why not?" He sensed that Yan Wushi's current personality was different from all the previous ones. Rather, it felt a little like the one who'd smiled gently at him several days ago. "Because, once I've healed, I won't be able to talk to you anymore," said Yan Wushi. "Don't tell me that you prefer that Yan Wushi who ignored your sincerity and delivered you to Sang Jingxing." "You are him," said Shen Qiao. "I am not." Shen Qiao was at a loss. "Then, who are you?" Yan Wushi was silent for a moment. "You can call me Ah Yan." Shen Qiao did not respond. "Why don't you call me that just once? Please. I've never heard you say my name before." Shen Qiao was stupefied. "When I look at your face, I can't bring myself to say it." Yan Wushi complained. "A face is just the surface, a shell. Why put so much stock in appearances? I know everything he did to you. Yan Wushi might be a fickle ingrate, but I'd never turn my back on you. Ah, Qiao, it's impossible to find a second person as kind as you in this world. He might not cherish you, but I will. Won't you let me?" Shen Qiao stopped talking and refused to respond further. But Yan Wushi didn't give up. He was about to say something more, but then he saw Chun Gong's horse suddenly slow. The other man turned his head to glance at them. Seeing the two of them whispering to each other, he couldn't help but jab at them. Looks like the rumors were untrue. Taoist Master Shan and Yan Wushi get along quite well. That puts me at ease too. With the kind of support from the two of you, I need not worry about failing to find the carnelian on this trip. Shun Chao looked up at the sky. Having lived here for several days, he's also gained some understanding of the local weather. Is there a sandstorm coming? Chun Gong naturally didn't know, but he'd brought along people who did. Ruoqiang said, "Correct. There's a small town right ahead of us. My lord, why don't we rest there for the night and then continue the journey tomorrow? We can take the opportunity to change our mounts as well." Once this man had been full of arrogance, but now he was perfectly happy to call Chun Gong his lord. Shun Chao couldn't help glancing at him. Mu Rongqing's expression remained the same as ever, as though he didn't find this master-servant relationship insulting to himself in the slightest. He should have venerated the Emperor of Qi, Gao Wei, as his lord, yet now he was honoring Chun Gong. As if he'd sensed his feelings, Yan Wushi leaned over behind Shun Chao to speak into his ear. The Mu Rong family has already pledged their loyalty to Chun Gong in secret. Yan Wushi's hot breath fanned over his ear, making it so Shun Chao couldn't help but lean forward himself. After a short journey, they arrived at the little town. With Chun Gong's retinue blaring their wealth and presence, they booked the best inn in town the moment they entered, though in truth it was the town's only inn. Its lodgings were quite a bit worse compared to Bana's house, let alone that of the royal capital. But they were in a remote location after all, so just finding a place to rest was already quite remarkable. No one had any complaints, and after dinner, everyone returned to their rooms without a word. The inn had a limited number of rooms, so Shun Chao and Yan Wushi shared one. Shun Chao wasn't a curious person by nature, but he still found himself concerned at the way Chun Gong had gone from a perfectly ordinary youth to someone so full of mysteries on their next meeting. Especially when these mysteries were likely related to the goal of this trip and their safety, Shun Chao couldn't afford to be lax. If we're talking about power, Chun Gong derives all of his from the Lord of Qi, he mused. So, if the Lord of Qi perishes, Chun Gong will be left with nothing. Mu Rongqing was the best martial artist in Qi's imperial court, but he willingly became Chun Gong's subordinate and addresses him as Lord. On a fundamental level, this is incredibly odd. Ever since Yan Wushi's massive shift in personality, his eyes would always follow Shun Chao. Whether Shun Chao stood up or sat down, his gaze remained fixed on him, and Shun Chao, of course, felt it. He wasn't a corpse. It just made him feel terribly awkward. After he finished speaking, he couldn't help but frown. "Why do you keep staring at me?" "Because you're good-looking." Yan Wushi smiled at him, and it was as if 10 miles of peach blossoms were blooming in the spring breeze, their branches glittering like gems as the moon's crystal glow seeped through them. Shun Chao sighed, realizing that even though this Yan Wushi still wasn't very normal, he was still somewhat better than the ones prior. "Talk about proper things." "Did Chun Gong know martial arts before?" Yan Wushi suddenly asked. With this reminder, Shun Chao suddenly realized where that sense of disconnect had come from. Before, not only did Chun Gong not know martial arts, he could barely read more than a handful of characters. Where had he learned martial arts from? There'd be the couple of moves he'd learned from Shun Chao for self-defense, but those were only enough to deal with a bandit or two at most. But the current Chun Gong moved with restraint, his steps limber. It was obvious he'd already passed a certain stage in his martial arts journey. Perhaps not a first-rate martial artist, but at least second-rate, enough to enter into the top ranks of the Jianghu. How could he have progressed by such leaps and bounds in such a short period of time? Most people had to start their training at a young age, yet Chun Gong was like a tower that had been erected overnight. It was terribly suspicious. Also, previously when I said to return to Chang'an, you said it was too late, Shun Chao said. Did something happen over there? Will the Lord of Zhou be all right? Shun Xiao shook his head. Having spent most of the day on horseback, his face was heavy with fatigue. Even though he'd only been sitting, spared the need to focus on the road, he was still heavily injured. Just the bumps and jolts along the way had been enough to aggravate those wounds. My head hurts a little. A pained expression surfaced on his face, and he reached toward his head to touch the injury. Shun Qiao saw this right away and grabbed his hand. Don't move. He placed his hand on Yan Wusher's back and channeled a few wisps of true qi inside. Shun Qiao's present internal cultivation came from the Zhuyang strategy and was neutral and gentle. But when it entered Yan Wusher's body, it only aggravated his pain, and his expression twisted in agony. Shun Qiao had no choice but to quickly stop what he was doing. Yan Wusher's body was boiling, as if he were standing inside a blazing furnace. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Sect Leader Yan, called Shun Qiao softly. Yan Wusher grabbed his hand. Despite his stupor, he still remembered to say, Call me Yan. Shun Qiao said not a word. A lot of things you said are a mess in my mind, so I can't explain. Perhaps Yan Wusher knows, but I don't. Does that mean that each personality has limited access to his memories? Shun Qiao pondered with a frown. Let me sleep first, Yan Wusher said. His voice grew quieter and quieter. By the end of his sentence, his eyes were already closed. In truth, Buddhist Master Xueting and the others wanting to kill Yan Wusher wasn't because his death would make the world right again. They'd wanted to stop Huanyue's sect from expanding its authority in northern Zhou, and furthermore, they wanted to stop Huanyue's sect from assisting the Lord of Zhou in uniting the lands. Hence, their final target was Yuanyong. Now that Yan Wusher was already dead in the eyes of outsiders, Huanyue's sect was without a leader. Bian Yanmei would be struggling to stabilize the sect, so he'd definitely be remiss on his protection of Yuanyong. With this, an opportunity arose for others to take advantage of. So Yan Wusher's too late probably meant that something was about to happen to Yuanyong. But they'd already arrived in Tuyuhun, which was thousands of miles away from Chang'an, and they were about to enter the vast, desolate desert where few people trod. Even without taking Yan Wusher into consideration, Bana's godfather was still in Chunggong's hands, so Shun Qiao couldn't just turn and leave. The only thing he could do now was continue onward and help Chunggong obtain the carnelian first. Early the next morning, Chunggong sent his men over to wake them up. Yan Wusher was still in a deep sleep. No matter how they called him, he wouldn't wake. Shun Qiao had no choice but to place Yan Wusher at the front of the horse while he sat behind him. He wrapped his arms around Yan Wusher to hold the reins, thus preventing him from tumbling off along the way. Seeing this, Chunggong handed him a bottle of medicine. Inside are pills that can increase alertness and replenish qi. Give Sect Leader Yan a couple. Perhaps they'll help. Thank you, said Shun Qiao. But I don't know what his condition is, so rashly giving him medicine might not be the best decision. Chunggong smiled. Don't worry. They're concocted of mild ingredients, like wolfberry and wild sage. In the case they're ineffective, they won't kill him. If my guess is correct, he's like this due to the several injuries he suffered from the fight with Douyan Shan's group. Normally, I'd be happy to just laugh at him from the sidelines, but right now, we're all in the same boat. If something happens to Yan Wusher, you'll be distracted, which doesn't benefit me at all. He'd spoken the truth. Yan Wusher's situation wasn't looking too hopeful. His body's true qi was in disorder, leaving him unable to accept any from outside sources. Shun Qiao was completely at the end of his rope. He took the bottle and tipped out 2 pills, then fed them to Yan Wusher. Not long after, the man suddenly moved. He hacked up a large mouthful of blood before slowly opening his eyes. Shun Qiao suddenly realized something. If the pills really only contained mild ingredients, they couldn't have been this effective. What other things are in these pills? He asked Chunggong. This time, Chunggong was honest. Ginseng and snow lotus. I didn't tell you before because I was afraid that you wouldn't let him take any, thinking they'd be too potent. Shun Qiao then asked Yan Wusher, How do you feel? He didn't reply, but his drooping eyelids fluttered a little, as if giving him a glance. Then they slid closed again, and he arduously straightened himself while on the horse. but his face was a chilly white, and a faint sheen of sweat covered his forehead. Looks like it won't be any issue to keep going. Let's go. Chunggong seemed to be in a hurry to reach his destination. Though he didn't show it too much, Shenqiao could sense it. The little town didn't have any camels they could switch to, so the group could only continue on horseback. Fortunately, the area wasn't completely covered in sand. Scattered rocks could be seen, meaning that they were still in the Gobi Desert. Yan Wushi didn't speak to Shenqiao again for the rest of the journey. He only drowsily leaned against Shenqiao's back. The fact that he was still alive was already enough to attract much attention, but Chunggong's men paid little heed to him, even Ruoqiang. They seemed to have another goal in mind, and this goal was far more important than Yan Wushi. It was difficult for horses to travel in the Gobi Desert. As the sandstorms blew harder, they were forced to dismount and walk while leading the horses. Martial artists traveled quickly. After walking for over a half a day, from dawn to dusk, they were already far from the little town. Only a sea of golden sand lay around them, and even martial experts were helpless against it. Fortunately, they'd long prepared for this and covered their faces with cloaks and heads with scarves. That way, they managed to avoid getting sand in their mouths. The one who walked in front was a rather homely, middle-aged man. Shenqiao didn't know him, and Chunggong had no intention of introducing him either. But it was obvious he didn't know any martial arts and wasn't part of Ruoqiang's group. Chunggong had brought him to scout out their path. The man held a compass in hand as they rode high astride a horse. Since he was in charge of discerning their direction, someone led the horse for him. Then suddenly, he raised a hand. Immediately, Ruoqiang yelled, "Halt!" Everyone stopped in their tracks and stared at the middle-aged man's back. For a long time, the man watched the compass with his head lowered. Then he turned and jogged over to Chunggong, wiping haphazardly at the sweat on his face with his scarf. "My lord, something strange. Once we got here, the compass stopped working." Chunggong's brow furrowed. "Didn't you say before that we should walk in this direction?" Faced with Chunggong's blazing stare, the man was almost unable to finish his sentence. Yes, but now, please look at this." He passed the compass to Chunggong, who looked at it. The needle was spinning wildly with no sign of rest. Naturally, Chunggong didn't understand. "What does this mean?" The man smiled apologetically. "If this lowly one guess is correct, the ancient city of Ruoqiang that your esteemed self is looking for must be right underneath, and it indeed has something inside it. That something is interfering with the compass needle. Perhaps it's the cornelian you're after? But because of this interference, this lowly one is unable to find the entrance to the city." Everyone raised their heads and looked around, but all they could see was an ocean of yellow sand, blurring even the boundary between heaven and earth. Occasionally, they could spot a few bare rocks nearby, but not even a hint of the so-called ancient ruins. Chunggong asked Ruoqiang, "What do you think?" Ruoqiang thought for a while. Why don't we wait for the sandstorm to stop first, my lord?" Chunggong frowned. "But there's no place to use as shelter here." He turned back to the guide. "Should we keep going, or should we stop here and wait? Give me a definite answer." Chunggong's words were flippant, but the man dared not reply recklessly. He hesitated, unable to decide, fearful that they'd make the wrong decision due to his answer, which would cost him his head. He scratched at his face anxiously. It's... Think carefully before you answer," said Chunggong coldly. The man shuddered hard, then blurted, "We should keep going." "Are you sure?" "Yes, of course. This lowly one will lead the way. Judging from the compass's response, it should be around here somewhere. We'll find it eventually if we keep looking." "Then let's go," said Chunggong. Everyone continued onward, and Shenqiao followed behind them. He looked back at Yan Wushi, now sprawled prone on horseback, then hesitated for a moment. "Are you Yan Wushi, or someone else?" The man quietly extended a hand from beneath his robe and grabbed Shenqiao's wrist, still holding the reins. "It's me, Yan." Shun Xiao had no words, but he internally breathed a sigh of relief. Though he'd saved Yan Wushi, deep inside his heart, he didn't want to have too much contact with him. After Yan Wushi's massive change in disposition, both personalities born from him, Yan and Xieling, were much easier to speak with than the original. At least, when he was with them, Shun Xiao could manage to pretend that they were two other people entirely instead of Yan Wushi. Suddenly, a man in front yelled in surprise, "My lord! He's gone!" Chapter 62. The Only One in the World. The moment he said this, everyone looked over. Sure enough, they could find no trace of the middle-aged man, and the yellow sands before them grew increasingly turbid, whipped into whirling eddies over the flat ground. Visibility had dropped to the lowest. Shen Chao couldn't even see which silhouette was Changong, let alone the middle-aged man. Ruoqiang arduously made his way to the front and grabbed Changong. He yelled, "The sandstorm is too strong. My lord, please take shelter over there." Changong gritted his teeth. "No, none of us know our way around. We must follow him closely." Just as he spoke, the sandstorm grew even fiercer. Lifting their heads, they could see the yellow sands being blown by the darkened skies. Tears sprang up as sand blew into their eyes, blurring their vision. In this kind of situation, even the strongest of martial artists was no match for nature. They could only wind their scarves tighter, but the sandstorm made it near impossible for anyone to continue forward. Shun Chao clutched Yan Wushi's wrist in a tight grip while doing his best to hunch over, reducing the force of the wind against his body. Frightened, the horses began to struggle. The moment Shun Chao's attention slipped, the reins were yanked out of his hands. By the time he looked back, the horse was nowhere to be found. The wind shrieked within his ears, and the haze of endless yellow was all he could see. "My lord, this way." Shun Xiao dimly heard Ruoqiang's words, and he quickly hurried in their direction. But then his next step landed on empty air, and his entire person slid downward. Beneath him seemed to be a bottomless abyss, the sloped walls treacherously steep. Shun Chao felt like he'd been falling for ages, yet there was still nowhere for his feet to secure himself. Another couple of moments passed before he felt the incline lessen, if only slightly. With one hand on the boulder behind him, Shun Chao steadied himself, then managed to straighten while standing on the slope. Inky darkness filled his eyes. He couldn't see his hand before his face, but this actually gave him a sense of nostalgic familiarity. The wind that had been howling into his ears had vanished, leaving his surroundings as silent as the grave. Except for the sounds of breathing that came from below, rapid yet feeble. "Who's there?" asked Shun Xiao. Those breaths paused. Then after a long silence, they weakly replied, "It's me." Shun Xiao groped his way down the slope, leaping and jumping to where the voice was coming from. "How did you end up down here?" He clearly remembered letting go of Yan Wushi's hand before he fell. "Ah, Xiao, my arms seem to be dislocated, and my head hurts." Shun Xiao took in Yan Wushi's words silently. He'd already had that crack in his skull, and now he'd fallen from such a high place. How could his head not hurt? Shun Xiao could only walk over to him. "Which arm?" "Right arm," said Yan Wushi. Shun Xiao felt along the arm and set the joint. Yan Wushi gave a muffled grunt, but he didn't cry out in pain. "Wait for me here," said Shun Xiao. "I'm going ahead to take a look." But just as he was about to step forward, Yan Wushi grabbed the edge of his robe. "Won't your head hurt even more if you stand and walk now?" asked Shun Xiao. "No," said Yan Wushi. Shun Xiao didn't want to waste too much time on conversation. He was also afraid that he might end up unable to find Yan Wushi even if he tried to come back due to their lack of bearings here. "Very well, let's walk slowly and find Changong first." Even though they were speaking in hushed tones, an echoing emptiness still lingered around them. It was obvious that they were somewhere underground, and it was somewhere quite spacious, perhaps like a cavern. But these happenings had been so strange and bizarre that they couldn't afford to drop their guard. Uneven stones lay beneath their feet. A moment of carelessness would be enough for them to trip. But these stones didn't seem to be randomly placed. In fact, it was the opposite. When Shun Xiao bent over to touch a couple, he found that they'd been neatly cut, their edges uniform. There were even faint patterns on their surface, a sure sign that they were man-made. Ruoqiang, said Yen Wushi. His voice quavered, and he did his best to speak as little as possible, condensing the sentence. Is this place the Ruoqiang they were speaking of? Into just 2 syllables. Perhaps the fall had given him another concussion. Shun Xiao made a sound of assent. It's possible. He fished out a torch from his lapels and lit it. The torch's glow was only enough to illuminate a small area around them, but when Shun Xiao managed to discern where they were, his heart involuntarily gave a thump. They weren't standing at the true bottom, because only a couple of steps away, the ground abruptly dropped down, forming another massive pit of depths unknown. If they hadn't fallen here earlier, if their momentum had been just a little greater, they'd have fallen into that abyss instead, and who knew how that would have ended up. Right after this moment, Yan Wushi spoke next to his ear. Ah Xiao, I think I saw someone ahead of us just now. Shun Xiao asked, Did you make out who it was? Yan Wushi's next words were hair-raising. It didn't look like a person. Ooh. The flaming stick in their hands made them very conspicuous in this darkness. If Zheng Gong and his men had seen them, they should have said something. But there was only one path beneath their feet. If they didn't continue onward, they'd have come to turn back. Let's go in the opposite direction then, said Shun Xiao. The path was narrow. Only one person could pass at a time. The firelight flickered as if about to go out, yet the darkness was both vast and endless. In a situation like this, the presence of humans became tiny and insignificant, something like darkness could engulf at any moment. Yan Wushi said suddenly, How did you feel back when you were blind? Shun Xiao started slightly, then was silent for a moment. Nothing in particular. It was fine after I got used to it. Why didn't you feel any hatred? Shun Xiao thought for a moment. I did feel resentment, but not hatred. It's exhausting to hold on to too many things. Of course, there are many people with evil intentions in this world, but there are even more people willing to lend a helping hand. I wish to remember those people, not the things that will only bring me despair and suffering. Yan Wushi sighed. But all the people I've seen have treated you poorly. If not for you, Cheng Gong could never have the glory he possesses today. But not only did he forget the kindness you showed him, he even returned it with further animosity by threatening you into exploring Ruoqiang with him. Shun Xiao countered coolly. There were good people. You just didn't see them. Back when you delivered me to Sang Jingxing, leaving me no choice but to forsake my own martial arts so he would perish with me, there was a young Taoist priest at Bailong Monastery, and he just happened to be the little boy we saved outside Xiang Province's city. If not for his timely rescue, I wouldn't be standing here and talking to you right now. Afterward, He Huan's sect came for me, and though the abbot of Bailong Monastery knew that he could save himself by handing me over, he chose to give up his own life instead. When people like them exist, how can I possibly let myself sink into hatred? Shun Xiao's heart is very small. There's only room enough for good people like them. As for those who don't deserve to be remembered, I won't spare them anything, not even hatred. Then what about Yan Wushi? Do you not hate him either? If not for the fact that your death might affect the state of both Northern Zhou and the world itself, we wouldn't be standing here having this conversation. Yan Wushi laughed. In truth, you do hold hatred, but you're too forgiving and soft-hearted, so even your hatred doesn't last for long. Ah, Chao, your weaknesses are too obvious. That's why anyone can use them to coerce you, just like Cheng Gong did. You could have seized Cheng Gong and threatened him into releasing Bana's grandfather. Even that would have been better than following him all the way here. True, said Shanchao. I could have done that, but if I did, you'd have no way of escape. You're saying that I should have just left you behind, correct? Yan Wushi answered softly, No, but I understand why my previous self treated you the way he did. He's a paranoid person at heart, someone who'd never trust anyone else. No matter how good you are, he'd always want to bring out the darkness hidden within you. But he doesn't know that you are you. There may be hundreds of thousands of Changgongs in this world, but there is only one Shanqiao. Oh my god. Shanqiao sighed. Now I really do somewhat believe that you're not him, because Yan Wushi would never say something like that. Yan Wushi said gently, Of course I'm not him. I'm Ah Yan. Don't you have a headache? How can you still talk so much? Yan Wushi went quiet. He no longer made a peep. In the span of their conversation, the two of them had already rocked for about 15 minutes, one in front and the other in the back. Shanqiao suddenly stopped. The torch, down to its last embers, finally flickered out in the darkness. His voice carried some bewilderment. We seem to have come full circle. At the end of the path was a pitch-black cave, exactly the same as the one they'd seen earlier. Was this place a circle all along? So we only walked from one end to the other? He'd just said this when someone's voice came from up ahead. Is that Taoist Master Shen? It was Tuo Ba Liangzhi. Shenqiao raised his voice in reply. It is. Where are you? I also fell down from above earlier. I hit my head and fainted. I woke up just now. May I ask if Taoist Master Shen has seen our Lord and his men? I haven't, said Shenqiao. We've been unable to find our way out since we fell down. Did you find anything? There's a door here, said Tuo Ba Liangzhi. There seem to be stairs behind it, but it's too dark for me to see. When I fell, my torches went missing as well. Do you have more? I do, said Shenqiao. There's one left. They might have each had their own goals and sides, but they were in a cooperative relationship at the moment, and if they wanted to break through, they'd have to work together. Shenqiao lit the torch and walked over. Sure enough, Tuo Ba Liangzhi was waiting for them at the cavern entrance. As they came closer, it was easy to see the large blood stain on his forehead. Did you find some other passages earlier? No, said Shenqiao. Then it seems we can only try going down. Right at this moment, Shenqiao suddenly saw a hairy hand materialize behind Tuo Ba Liangzhi. It had 5 fingers tipped in reddened nails and was about to land on Tuo Ba Liangzhi's shoulder. The thing that approached so silently that they'd actually failed to notice it. He had no idea whether it was even human. Before Shenqiao could open his mouth, Tuo Ba Liangzhi too sensed something wrong. He turned abruptly and thrust his sword at it. But the sword didn't pierce the newcomer's body. Instead, as if it encountered an iron wall, the tip of his sword actually bent a little. Tuo Ba Liangzhi retreated at top speed. Shenqiao shoved the torch into Yan Wushi's hand, then drew Shan Hetong Bei while rushing forward. The thing was tall and heavyset. It didn't look like anyone from the entourage. Shenqiao remembered Yan Wushi's suggestion that it wasn't human, and he didn't dare be reckless. He channeled true qi into his sword, causing it to glow a faint white. Even if the newcomer was a bronze or iron wall, this thrust would still be able to pierce it through. But though that monster looked clumsy, it was actually incredibly agile. Jumping left and right, it managed to evade Shenqiao's sword. It seemed entirely focused on Tuo Ba Liangzhi as it spread its fingers and grabbed him. Now that he was close to it, Shenqiao could feel a heavy stench strike him in the face. The monster's body was covered in hair, and its eyes shone a dim green. It looked like an ape. Everything happened in the span of a blink. Tuo Ba Liangzhi had thought that Shenqiao would take most of the pressure off him. He didn't expect the creature's relentless pursuit as it pounced on him. To his right was a bottomless abyss. Behind him was Yan Wushi. There was no space to dodge, so he could only clamber onto the wall on his left. With a couple of heaps, he was already several yards off the ground. But the ape continued to chase him, and it even followed him up the wall at a speed even greater than them, the martial artists. It was just about to grab Tuobao Liangzhe, who leapt to the side and down, but then he did something Shen Qiao could never have expected. He reached out toward Yan Wushi, preparing to grab him and toss him to the ape, thus extricating himself from the situation. But his hand missed as he extended it forward, and he caught nothing but empty air. Chapter 63. Several Yan Wushis. The ape pounced the top of Tuobao Liangzhe, and together they fell into the abyss. Only Tuobao Liangzhe's shocked cry lingered, echoing through the empty space around them. Yan Wushi, who'd almost become a human shield courtesy of Tuobao Liangzhe, was currently pressed against the stone wall as he gasped. His face was as pale as a ghost, and the flickering, feeble firelight seemed to suffuse it in an almost apathetic, stony coldness. Shen Qiao breathed a sigh of relief, then went up to take his pulse. "Are you all right?" Yan Wushi stiffened a little at first, but he soon relaxed and let him press down on his wrist. Shen Qiao's brows were tightly pinched, but it wasn't due to his reaction. "Why is your true qi growing increasingly chaotic? It's like it's brawling within your body." Yan Wushi said, "I used my true qi just now." Shen Qiao could hear just how exhausted and spent he was from those couple of words. It was a shock. Before he could react, Yan Wushi was already collapsing toward him, his entire body falling against Shen Qiao. Shen Qiao was forced to catch him. Unprepared for the icy cold of his skin, Shen Qiao jolted, shuddering. The situation was a little similar to what had happened in Chun during Yan Wushi's qi deviation after dueling Ruoqiang, and the seeds of his current illness had also been planted that day. Yan Wushi was trembling as well. It made him unconsciously try to press closer to Shen Qiao, wanting to draw some warmth. Due to what had happened last time, Shen Qiao didn't dare to pass true qi to him carelessly. "How are you feeling? If you can't walk, let's rest here for a moment first." Yan Wushi forced 2 words out through gritted teeth. "Let's go." Shen Qiao sighed. He bent at the waist, pulled Yan Wushi onto his back, and then walked toward the cavern exit, using his sword as support. Sect leader Yan, who'd once been unrivaled throughout the Jianghu, who disdained all great heroes as unworthy, had probably never dreamed that he'd see such a day. They didn't have any torches left, but before the last one died, Shen Qiao had indeed spotted stairs beneath the cavern exit. They were incredibly steep, but the existence of stairs meant that people had once lived down there in the past. Most likely, it was there that the ancient city of Ruoqiang that Cheng Gong was looking for waited. The man on Shen Qiao's back continued to shiver, but his will was so strong that he refused to let out a single moan. The ape that had attacked them earlier must have lived here for a long time. It grabbed Tuobao Liangzhe and fallen down with him. So, did that mean that below them wasn't the bottomless abyss they'd imagined, but a passage leading somewhere else? Shen Qiao walked down the stairs, step by step, thinking as he went. Yan Wushi said hoarsely, "I'm not Yan." Shen Qiao grunted in reply, "I know." The man's expression when he'd watched Tuobao Liangzhe fall, and the way he'd reacted when Shen Qiao touched his gate of life was enough to tell Shen Qiao that the personality within Yan Wushi's body had changed again. After interacting with him for several days, Shen Qiao had roughly inferred what was going on. One of the personalities was his original one, which he'd tentatively referred to as Yan Wushi. Another was the one who called him Meizhe and Guge, Xieling. Though this personality was somewhat innocent, his guard was just as high, and he disliked speaking. However, he trusted Shen Qiao probably because Shen Qiao had been the first person he'd seen upon waking up, or perhaps because he could sense that Shen Qiao didn't have any malice. In any case, Xieling did anything he was told to do, which made dealing with him fairly painless. The real Yan Wushi would never do something like that. And the last personality was the one who'd been conversing with him earlier. This personality had a much milder temper, and you could discuss some things with him. Out of all the Yan Wusher's personalities, he was the easiest to get along with. Shen Chao asked, "Then who are you right now?" But Yan Wusher's answer was paradoxical. "I'm him, but I'm also not him." The true Qi within his body was rampaging, so he must have been in extreme agony at this moment. But if he didn't want to focus on the pain, he could only distract himself by talking. "So, you aren't Yan Wusher, or Xieling, or Ayan?" "I don't know. My head is a mess. Sometimes I'll recall certain things. Sometimes I feel like those things didn't actually happen to me. Maybe I don't even know the things I did just a moment ago." Shen Chao was already used to this kind of situation. Once we find the Jade Sistange, your situation should take a turn for the better. The Jade Sistange can only heal external injuries. It's ineffective against internal ones. Then what must you do to fully recover? Wait until I patch the flaw in the Fenglan scriptures. Didn't you say that it's impossible to repair the flaw in the demonic core? Tinged with surprise, Shen Chao's voice echoed down the passage. Yan Wusher couldn't remember much at that moment, but he still recalled how he had treated Shen Chao. How, when he'd personally delivered him to Sang Jingxing, he had almost been able to see Shen Chao's heart withering within his eyes. How Shen Chao had said to him, "The reason I'm met with betrayal after betrayal isn't because I'm naive. It's because I believe that kindness will always exist. If there were no fools like me, where would Sect Leader Yan find your pleasure?" And it hadn't been long since then. Just how had Shen Chao felt when he'd faced him anew? "I've already found the method," he said coolly. There was still a hint of remaining warmth within his chest, left there by Xieling and Ayan from their feelings whenever they thought about Shen Chao. But at this moment, Yan Wusher forcefully wiped it away, and his gaze fell a short distance in front of Shen Chao. "Someone's there," he said. At practically the same moment, Shen Chao stopped. He'd also heard it, that fleeting yet heavy sound of breathing. "Who's there?" Shen Chao asked. In the darkness, a pair of glowing green eyes shone like ghost fire lamps, suspended in mid-air as they stared at the two. At the same time, the thick, heavy stench of blood spread through the area. The ancient city of Ruoqiang, decrepit and neglected for ages, was indeed full of dangers. All right, everyone, that concludes the reading of chapters 60 through 63. And, you know, I really don't know what to say at all about this. Honestly, I think the many different Yan Wushers is very funny, and it's crazy because I remember I'm actually a part of this Danmei Facebook group where many people have complained about Yan Wusher's personality, calling him like bipolar or schizophrenic and yada yada yada. And I never thought that, but as I'm rereading, I'm just like, did we read the same book? Because clearly he's got a fracture in his freaking skull and his chi is all over the place. And so these different aspects of him are not him being bipolar. Like Xieling is his true name, you know, from when he was a child. Ayan could be like a nickname that he maybe had at a certain point in life. And then, of course, there's just Yan Wusher. And now this one that's, it's me, but it's also not me. I don't know who that is. But it's clear that internally, he is all jacked up from that battle of 5 against 1, and he's not fully recovered from that. Also, he's just a hard-shelled man who's clearly been through something that has hardened his heart. Yet the impressions of Xieling, like it said in like the last couple minutes or so, Xieling and Ayan have left an impression in him, which is really just his inner self. So anyway, I'm not going to ramble because that's not relevant. The point is we finished these chapters and I hope you enjoyed them. Now we need to see how they're going to escape these crazy green-eyed, red-painted fingernail apes, because I'm scared of them. Honestly, when I imagine them in my head, they look scary.